Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Darwinism Deselected. This is episode 2. And to introduce this particular episode, what I want to do is speak about a conversation that happened between Richard Dawkins and Hamza Swartzes outside the World Atheist Convention in 2011. Now, what actually happened was Dawkins came out. They had a brief interaction, and in that interaction, there is a greater insight you get into Dawkins' mind, and in fact, how he diverts away from the main issues. But what's interesting is he straight away asks Hamza, "Do you believe in evolution?" And Hamza's like, "I don't have enough evidence to make a decision on that." Now, that's actually a adequate answer because we need to define what evolution means. We need to define what is relevant evidence, what is the evidence, what is the argument, what is the actual meaning of evolution, Darwinism, whatever it is we're actually speaking about. But anyway, Dawkins goes on to say, well, you do believe the planets orbit the sun, don't you? And he tried to mock him and tried to make it that evolution is as clear as day. But then as the conversation progressed, he went down from that epistemic point. He went down a few steps in the ladder, and then he started actually decreasing in his certainty when speaking about evolution, talking about clues and coming to a crime scene afterwards and making inferences and this and that. So you could see in this conversation, this is the way that Darwinists begin. They begin off with certainty, they begin off with mockery, and then when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, you start to see actually they're not able to substantiate the point that they initially began off with. And then the conversation actually covered a few more things unrelated directly to evolutionary science. Actually, broadly, they spoke about some philosophical issues. Check out that conversation. I actually did a commentary on that, and it's quite an interesting interaction. But it just goes to show you the mind that these Darwinists actually have. Now, I have with me, mashallah, the Sapience guys. We're all here. And one of the things that I wanted to do in this episode, the same as the last one, is to get everyone to interact, right? Interact as much as possible. There's no such thing as a stupid question. There's no such thing as too basic of a question. And there's no problem repeating a point that's been made previously. Now, I just want you guys to read this slide in regards to the pressure that Darwinists build when it comes to believing in their ideology. So Dawkins says, it is absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, by rather not consider that. That's a pretty strange statement, because would a physicist say that about string theory or even general relativity, which has a lot more going for it than the neo-Darwinist camp does? It just goes to highlight the type of narrative that he began off with when he was speaking to Hamza, and the way that he actually conducts himself generally, and the way that Darwinists usually try and create that sort of atmosphere. Now, what's interesting about this, and this is the next slide, it's not just a case of Dawkins in his public relations with people that he's actually forcing this type of culture, this atmosphere of acceptance. You have to be an ignorant or a stupid person not to believe in evolution. And, other people say evolution is just as true as gravity, and how could you not believe in it? And, they have all these narratives, and the same thing in academia. And I found this really interesting segment in a book by Fodor and Palmarini. I hope I said that correctly. So one of them is a scientist, one is a philosopher, both of them are atheists. And in their book, What Darwin Got Wrong, they say something in the beginning of the book which they put under the chapter of terms of engagement. So before they tackle Darwinism in the book, before they criticize Darwin, and these are two bona fide academics, they first have to qualify themselves, justify themselves, protect themselves, give a few caveats. And it's a very submissive, it's a very weird and dark way for academics to conduct themselves. You just go in and say, "Oh, I think this is right or this is wrong," and you just go in. I mean, look at the books on this shelf. Pick up any book that's critiquing any scientific theory. You'll just go in. But with Darwinism, we have to be careful. We have to be sensitive. We have to qualify ourselves. We have to show who we are. And what they say is this. This is not a book about God, nor about intelligent design, nor about creationism. Neither of us is into any of those. We thought we'd best make that clear from the outset, because our main contention in what follows will be that there is something wrong, quite possibly fatally wrong, with the theory of natural selection. And we are aware that even amongst those who are not quite sure what it is, allegiance to Darwinism has become a litmus for deciding who does and who does not hold a properly scientific worldview. Now look at the wording here, right? Even for those who are not quite sure what it is, allegiance to Darwinism, right? Now, they carry on. You must choose between faith in God and faith in Darwin. And if you want to be a secular humanist, you better choose the latter. So we're told. We doubt that those options are exhaustive, but we do want ever so much to be secular humanists. In fact, we both claim to be outright card-carrying, signed up, dyed in the wool, no holes barred atheists. That's pathetic. This groveling is pathetic. It is pathetic for academics in their advanced age, right? These are professors, these are scientists, these are philosophers, these are people who should be able to speak openly when it comes to the critique of Islam, or when it comes to the critique of religion in general, or when it comes to the critique of, say, a political worldview, or, say, the most celebrated scientific theories can be overturned, like Newtonian theory. Einstein didn't have to do all these qualifications when he's trying to tackle Newton. Newton's theory worked well for over 200 years. Einstein just went in for the jugular. He said, no, I think general relativity is a better explanation. There you have it. His idea of space and time was different. His idea of mass was different. Why would anybody need to do this?
Would you say it's a bit like criticizing a particular country at the moment? You know, if you have to criticize a certain place, but you have to qualify it by saying, I believe this, 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 and this, then you can make a criticism. Otherwise, you'll be labeled as something.
I love that. And do you know what's interesting? Some of the people in America who have, they believe in freedom of speech and, all this type of stuff, even they're getting a bit sick of, why can't I just criticize Israel? Why do I have to qualify myself? Why do I have to add X, Y, Z? Right? This is the same. And when that happens, something's wrong. And guess what? I'm very happy you raised that. Just like there is a lobby, AIPAC, and there's different lobbies in this country, Friends of the Conservative Friends of Israel, and so on and so forth. There are lobbies when it comes to Darwinism. There is a level of bullying. There is a level of academic restriction. There is a level of sociological pressure to accept the theory. And this is something that should be very concerning. Now, the first thing I want to do is congratulate everybody in this room, right? And I want to give them some good news, which is nobody has the monopoly on thinking. No one has the right to say, my brother, you need to stop thinking and accept Darwinism. You have the right to say, I want to question it. I want to question it. Just like someone saying, all this horrific stuff that's happening in Palestine, if someone's going to say, oh, you're an anti-Semite because you are saying this, you're going to say, no, I'm going to express my view. I'm seeing something that's wrong. I don't want kids to be killed. In the same way, we should be open to the possibility that Darwinism is wrong. We should be open to critiquing it without being labeled anti-scientific. It's anti-Semitic here and anti-scientific there, just to shut the conversation. And I'll tell you something interesting. Just like there are Jews out there who get labeled anti-Semitic, and that just looks ridiculous because they themselves are Semitic. Here we have atheists who are going to be called what? Like Jerry Fodor, he was being called a secular creationist. What is a secular creationist? He was being called a secular creationist because he doesn't believe in God, but he wants to criticize Darwin. Yes.
No, just saying the Jewish people who justifiably criticize Israel are called self-hating Jews. So in this case, the self-hating scientists, so some ridiculous label.
Yeah. They're seen as these types of Judas goats. They're seen as these types of traitors. How dare you, and like I mentioned in the last session, Alfred Russel Wallace, the first guy to jump ship from this idea that natural selection can explain everything. When it came to the human mind, he had doubts. So what happened to him over time? He got put to the side, and Darwinism became the theory being ascribed to him became the dominant narrative, when in the Victorian times, it was known as Darwin and Wallace's theory, right? Afterwards, it just became Darwinism. This became Darwin's theory, right? On the next slide, this is Thomas Nagel. He's again a well-respected atheist academic, right? What is it to be like a bat? That famous book on consciousness, and he's somebody who's right there at the top. Now, he published a book with Oxford University criticizing neo-Darwinism, and what's interesting is he's explaining the same atmosphere. The air has been poisoned. That same toxic attitude is prevalent not only across the pond in America, here in the UK as well, and in fact, all over the world. And he writes in Mind and Cosmos, I realize that such doubts about Darwinian naturalism will strike many people as outrageous. But that is because almost everyone in our secular culture has been browbeaten into regarding the reductive research program as sacrosanct, on the ground that anything else would not be science. This is very important. Look at his second statement. Just like the term anti-Semitic, you say as soon as you are critical of Darwinism, you're being anti-scientific. And they say this to who? Leave alone the intelligent design proponents. They say this to other atheist academics. Imagine that. There was this famous interview in which Dennis Noble was being asked. He was describing his experience, and when he started actually being critical of neo-Darwinism, he said, "Boiling water was put over me." Now, this is an Oxford professor. He was the doctoral examiner of Richard Dawkins back in '66. We're talking about a guy who's given decades of his life getting attacked. And that's not the only time he's spoken about this. And there's other people, Lynn Margulis and Masatashi Nai, and you will find so many academics who are willing to say, you know what, this is ridiculous, this has happened to that. But a lot of academics will do self-censorship. I remember Adnan Rashid telling me that he had a conversation with an evolutionary biologist here in London, in one of the universities. I know which university it is, but I won't say the name. And they were this academic was critical of aspects of Darwinism. And he opened up to Adnan and he said a few things. Then he said to him, don't use my name. Aki, this is London. This is London. An academic, a lecturer at a London university is scared to express their view when it comes to being critical of Darwinism. Something's wrong. So let's go with the good news. Everyone has the right to ask a question. Everyone has the right to not have someone else do the thinking for them. Nobody has the monopoly on thinking. We have the right to ask, okay, what's the evidence? And I've been debating Darwinists for years. And my number one tactic is not even to challenge Darwinism. It's to simply say, go ahead and give me your evidence. Don't shout at me Don't say you're anti-scientific. Don't say you're a creationist. Don't forget these labels. I am going to be your student. Just tell me, what does this theory say? And as soon as you say that, that's when their colors change. That's when they're like, okay, I need to give the evidence. As we're going to see later, there's been an inversion when it comes to the burden of proof as well. That's also one of the reasons why there's a prevailing onus that they put on us when it comes to Darwinism rather than themselves. Okay, if you go to the next slide, you're going to see something odd. Richard Dawkins is going around telling people, if you don't believe in evolution, you must be insane, ignorant, or whatever. Then you get all these academics saying this about, even if you don't understand what it is, you have to be, allied to the right side, to the side of Darwinism, right? And Masatashi Nai saying, Darwin is a god, you cannot criticize him. So you got all of this stuff. And then in a lesser known work, Dawkins says this: we must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. That's pretty strange. To go around telling people, you must be ignorant, you must be stupid, you must be so-and-so if you don't believe in it, and then to implicitly say, well, there is a chance that Darwinism could be wrong. There is a chance that future discoveries can make us abandon Darwinism. Do you see the contradiction here? What do you think's going on? What do you think's going on? There's no such thing as a wrong answer. But you're going to have to put your hand... Richard Dawkins... Wait.
You're allowed to speak.
Dawkins is covering all of his bases?
Yeah. There's one element of it. But why is he giving this particular qualification? What's the reason for this?
I guess he's acknowledging that it is a theory at the end of the day.
Yes. Yeah. Ultimately, there has to come a point where when you're writing academically, when you're working, if in case somebody accuses you of this or that in the future, you're like, well, but in this book I wrote this. So all science can change. Now, if that particular science cannot change, it's dogma, it's philosophy. It's not actually science. So what's interesting is in the conversation in the beginning that I summarized the conversation between Hamza Sotzes and Dawkins, Dawkins basically says to him, you do believe the planets go around the sun, don't you? When it comes to evolution. Yet, what I found interesting is in his same book, he uses the planets going around the sun for the very opposite conclusion to what he's telling Hamza. He actually says, Darwinism is not as true and unassailable as the planets going around the sun. So he will, when he's not being a debater, when he's not publicly speaking to the people about the theory, he will say outlandish things. He will say categorical things. He will say rhetorical things. That's when the sophistry suit comes on. Yeah. But when it comes to things that he has to write down academically, he has to pen, then he has to give these qualifications. So from his perspective, evolution is true. But Darwinism, here in A Devil's Chaplain, he's saying, well, that's not as true. It can change. Although, again, in the same book, he says something interesting. He says, if you find life elsewhere in the universe, that life would have evolved through a Darwinian mechanism. And he calls that universal Darwinism. He says this is true for the universe. Why do you think he says that? And this is, remember, this is him not seeing the evidence from biochemistry, from anatomy, from morphology, from physiology, from the fossil record or population genetics or bioinformatics, nothing. This is simply him making a blanket statement for the whole universe. If there's life anywhere, it has to be Darwinian. What's the cause of that?
I think it could be the context he's saying these things in, because he kind of has two modes, right? It's almost like a debate against religious people mode versus a scientific contribute to the scientific knowledge-based mode. So I think when it seems like, depending on what mode he's in or like what his target is, he will sort of abandon the sort of scientific thinking to try and play at people's emotions.
That's it.
More.
That's it. I think you're right. That's been my experience of him. And I've spent years and years going through his writing, going through his videos, looking at his podcast, looking at all this stuff. There is a public face, there is an academic face. And the reason why the academic face is there, because eventually he does have to rub shoulders with certain people who are going to say to him, what have you been saying in the public? Which is why he does actually get called out by other academics. There's actually an interesting book. It's called The Selfish Genius. Okay? Now, the selfish genius is a play on the words, the selfish gene. And what the book is basically in reference to is how Dawkins misrepresents science for his own interests. Right? And this is just one person who's calling him out. He's been called out by many, many people over many, many years for saying statements which he cannot justify. Okay, go to the next slide, which is slide number 7. This is what we were discussing earlier. And in fact, this is what me and Sheikh Ujaydi were discussing before we started this recording. And it's the most important point. What exactly does it mean when you say, do you believe in evolution? Do you believe in Darwinism? Do you believe in neo-Darwinism? What exactly does it mean? In front of you on slide 7, firstly, how many definitions are there here?
It's what?
And I don't believe this is exhaustive. This is not exhaustive. This is quite a list. This is why you have to define what you mean when you are speaking about these things. Okay? Now, let me just go over each definition briefly. Evolution is change over time. Today, Homo sapiens are running around throwing spears at each other. Well, they were a few thousand years ago. And a few, like 500, 600 million years ago, we had other creatures, around the Cambrian time, we had trilobites. Okay? So there's been a change in life on Earth. Descent through modification, things have changed, things have evolved. Okay. That's such a broad definition. Nobody would basically disagree with that definition of evolution. The way that Philip Johnson, the founder of intelligent design, the way that he put it is anything other than the creation of life in 6 literal days can fall under the rubric of evolution. That's how broad it is. That's how confusing it is. Okay, the second definition. Evolution is change in gene frequencies in a population. I'm sure whoever did biology here, you heard this definition, right? A levels, there's basic stuff, A level, and even maybe GCSEs, right? Or in other parts of the world, wherever your system is. What does this definition basically mean? What substance does it really carry? If we define evolution as change in gene frequencies in a population, in the gene pool. So I have brown eyes. I have family in which they have blue eyes. One is more dominant than the other. Over a few generations, there's a change in gene frequencies within this gene pool. So what? Again, it's a vanilla definition. It's a benign definition. It's not that helpful. Okay, evolution is chemical to biological matter. What does this mean? Evolution is chemical to biological matter.
It's like when something goes from not life to life effect.
Bang. Go, carry on.
Yeah, that's what I had to say.
Inorganic to organic.
Yeah.
So they say from chemical evolution to biological evolution. Interestingly, is this Darwinian or non-Darwinian? Is Darwin's origin of species about chemical to biological?
No.
No, not at all. However, when you put on a documentary, they talk about the bees and the birds and the elephants and the whales and what existed millions of years ago. They'll always have to begin off with this definition of evolution, and they will say life began and then this. You see, Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, the title can be misleading. He claims to have come up with an explanation for how new species develop. He never set out in the book to make the claim, I'm explaining the origin of life. People think the origin of life means the origin species means the origin of life. No. Darwinism begins after life. And for a lot of people, that's a shock. They're like, what? But I saw this documentary and I learned in school and this and that. And what did they do? They usually tell you, well, life began in a pond. You know, this happened or that happened. There's a abiogenesis theory or this or that, whatever. But the fact is, evolution, when it comes to chemical to biological, is not a Darwinian matter. This is not a Darwinian matter. This is something that Darwinism needs in order to flourish. And what did we cover last time? How many origins do they believe in?
2.
No.
It was one.
Why?
Because it's so unlikely that it could happen that it's almost possible that it could be more than once.
Yeah. Because it's such an unlikely event, they're assuming it to be once. Okay. Another one. Evolution is one universal common ancestor. Okay. What is this in reference to? This is also known as the tree of life. It's basically saying all of life, all of the millions and millions of organisms which are alive today and all of these species, everything goes back to one origin, one unique event, which they call Luca, the last universal common ancestor. Okay. Evolution is limited common ancestry. So the wolf and the dog, they have a common ancestor. The cat and the lion. Something like that. So evolution can mean limited common ancestry. Evolution is natural selection on a small scale. So you get bacteria. To the bacteria, you apply some antibiotics. Some of the bacteria develop resistance, and so they can outlive the treatment being given to them. You know, this is why penicillin doesn't work as well as it used to, right? That is a type of evolution. Evolution is natural selection on a large scale. And this is basically the blind watchmaker thesis, which is random mutations and natural selection can explain the eye, can explain the brain, can explain how bats have echolocation and why there's a particular hierarchy in the brains of certain invertebrates, whatever it is. You've got all of these large-scale changes which someone can say is evolution. Okay. Another definition, evolution is modern synthesis. Modern synthesis is a version of Darwinism which came about around 1940s. Okay? It developed between the 20s and the 40s. Darwinism, classic Darwinism, came about when Darwin was alive. After Darwinism came neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism simply means post-Darwinism. Modern synthesis came about in the 1940s. So when someone says evolution, they can be referring to an event, a particular view in the 1940s which came about. Another one is evolution is extended evolutionary synthesis. And this only came about, I believe, in 2010. This is a new version of evolution, a new version of Darwinism. Evolution is the third way of evolution, which is the works of Shapiro and Scott Turner and Dennis Noble and others. Evolution is theistic evolution, meaning randomness is taken out and is selection plus guided mutations or targeted mutations. Okay? Or naturalistic evolution, where they truly accept, where they truly believe in randomness. Then you have classical Darwinism, neo-Darwinism, Darwinism. Okay, now, here's the question. Is this confusing? Okay? If we do not go through a level of academic throat clearing and we do not get our Darwinian opponent to pin down what they mean, can our conversation be quite misleading and unproductive? They can be. The reason I went over all these definitions of evolution is to show that we have to define our terms. Because if we don't define our terms, Darwinists can actually play games with us. And I'm going to give you the most obvious game that they've been playing for decades. And it's the next slide. What do you see on this slide? This is slide number 8. I know evolution is true because we see evolution happening all the time. Can someone explain to me how this picture relates to the last slide? Yes.
It's effectively using one definition to prove all of it effectively. Because obviously you see the two cats that look very similar in the second one, and in the first one it goes from a cell to a human. So it's using the idea of like small changes, and you just have to assume that just happens at like a much larger scale, but without the evidence of the larger scale.
Exactly. This is known as the fallacy of equivocation. This is known as the fallacy of equivocation, and it is a very deceptive method. Now, I'm not saying this to strawman the opponents. I'm steelmanning their arguments. They literally do this. I've been in formal debates where my opponent is deliberately doing that. And about 10 years ago, when I had my debate with Aaron Ra, this was one of the first things I pointed out to him. And even in the videos that I was making and he was making, this deliberate use of evolution in two different contexts was being used. Now, here in the picture, the first term, evolution, is particle to man, is bacteria to a simple organism to a mammal or whatever, meaning it's large-scale evolution. This is known as the blind watchmaker thesis. This is the large, big stuff. The second thing, because we see evolution, like a dog and a wolf having a common ancestor, or bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics. In short, they're using the evidence of microevolution, basic evolution, general evolution, which no one and their grandmother nor the lamppost disagree with. They're using that to prove something which is grandiose, which is much harder to substantiate. And that's the crux of the argument. So, go back to the last slide. Some of the definitions here you're going to see are pretty vanilla. There's nothing controversial about them. Evolution is change over time. No problem. Did anyone have a problem with that? The ancient Hindus never had a problem with that. The ancient Babylonians never had a problem with that. Ancient Egyptians never had a problem with that. Nobody has a problem with that. Evolution is change in gene frequencies in a population. Okay. That's a pretty simple thing to observe. You have genes. some are dormant, some are recessive, some are, going to be fixed in a population over time, whatever. So gene frequencies, traits are being shifted in a population, in a gene pool. Okay, no problem. Evolution is chemical to biological matter. Aha. No. This is a tough one. This is one which was so difficult that Francis Crick had to point to aliens. This is so tough that some Darwinists know that until they resolve this issue, no one is going to believe the naturalistic Genesis story. Okay? So that is definitely not the same. Evolution is one universal common ancestor. Again, this is a tough one. This is one that you need independent evidence for. This is one in which we are talking about going back 4 billion years. And we're talking about incredible, not only deep time, probabilities and data. And there's a lot to it. This is one of the hardest things to even put together in a coherent argument, let alone if the argument is valid. Evolution is natural selection on a small scale. So, we have a bunch of sheep up north, which is true, right? A cold winter, a brutal winter, a bitter winter comes. Some sheep survive, others don't. The ones that survive, they have children, and those children are more likely to have woolier fur than everyone else, because the parents that survived had woolier wool, whatever you want to call it. They had more wool. So that wooliness is something heritable, and then the environment, the struggle of life, the differential reproduction, whatever they call it, because of that, you'll get more of that population with wool, and then they will have children, and then this carries on. Again, like, what's so difficult about that to accept? Evolution is natural selection on a large scale. This is how our eye evolved. This is how our brains evolved. This is how you had particular mammals trying to jump, and they kept hurting themselves, and then they eventually developed wings, right? Yes.
On the woollier wool example that you gave, how does that argument even work if there's no guarantee that your offspring will inherit your traits? Is it just an increased probability, so therefore it's more likely that the next population will also have it?
Yeah, that's a good question. We will assume for now, and we have good reason to believe this, that they will, right? Because traits are, we have a theory of hereditary, how traits are passed on. We understand it pretty clearly, that you have certain traits which you get from the parents, and those actually are transmitted to the next generation. And then if they're selected, then they carry on in the population. The point I was making is, can you use that to try and explain where sheep came from in the first place?
Right.
That's the point.
Yeah.
And as we're going to see, when we get deeper into this, into what Darwin said about this and others said about this, their entire argument is ultimately based on an analogy. That's all it is. Okay, evolution is the modern synthesis, which is also known as neo-Darwinism. Is that easy to substantiate in the same way that, bacteria develops resistance to antibiotics? No. There's assumptions of the modern synthesis, and there is a lot of detail which cannot be justified in the same way. Evolution is extended evolutionary synthesis. So this is something that came about fairly recently. So they've taken things like niche construction and plasticity and symbiogenesis. They've taken all this stuff after Darwin, and they tried to make a broader view. Evolution is third way of evolution. They don't believe in intelligent design. They don't believe in neo-Darwinism. They're doing their own sort of thing. Evolution is theistic evolution, naturalistic evolution, or so on and so forth. The easiest thing to do is to make two distinctions. And by the way, an honest Darwinist will accept this. A dishonest Darwinist will never accept this. The way you do it is like this. You say, can we please define the blind watchmaker thesis, natural selection working at a grand scale, can we define that as Darwinism? And can we please define evolution as the basic truism that we've all accepted for hundreds of years, that no one disagrees with? Now, if you go to the picture, I know evolution is true because we see Darwinism happening all the time. There's a problem with the logical structure of this question, with this statement, this proposition. So, when you get clarity and you say, listen, whatever we know to be true, microevolutionary changes, basic evolutionary changes, change over time, limited common ancestry, things that we can see, let's call that evolution. Okay? The mechanism, the blind watchmaker, which we're going to get into, what exactly is the mechanism? We're going to call that Darwinism. And why I'm saying the blind watchmaker? Does anyone see the reference? Who's that in reference to?
Dawkins.
No. Who came up with this watchmaker analogy? Aquinas? No, it wasn't Aquinas, it was someone else. Paley. So Paley had the argument about the watchmaker. Richard Dawkins published his book in the 1980s, The Blind Watchmaker, Natural Selection being the watchmaker. So that's why the argument should be very clear. All of this stuff that we all agree about, as Philip Johnson said, anything other than the 6-day literal creation is basically some form of evolution, yeah? We leave that as evolution, so no one disagrees with evolution. Darwinism is referring to the mechanism of the blind watchmaker, natural selection, plus random mutations. We're going to get into what those terms mean exactly in a bit more detail later, but let's just be very clear. Evolution, Darwinism. The third term, universal common ancestry, the tree of life. When you make these three distinctions, go back to the last slide, all of these definitions fall into these three. You can actually have a mechanism, you can have a history, and you can have an observation, broadly. The observation is evolution, the mechanism is, the predominant mechanism currently is Darwinism, the blind watchmaker, and the tree of life is the history, okay? If you define it in these three terms, the first thing you've achieved is you've taken all these definitions and you've made it into three simple categories. Okay? Secondly, you have denied your opponent the ability to commit the fallacy of equivocation. Okay. Does everyone get this? Because this is really important before we get into the definition of randomness and natural selection and those things. Does everyone understand why we're doing this, putting into these three categories? Any objections, comments? Okay. Now, I'm going to say something and I want you guys to challenge me and I want you to pretend like you're Darwinists or evolutionists. Okay? Darwin came up with one main idea. And that one main idea is the only thing that he came up with that was original, that was the main thrust of his argument, and it was underwhelming. Okay? And that was an analogy. If you pick up the origin of species, you will see it is one long argument from analogy. That's all it is. Now you would think to yourself, no, there's got to be more in there. Not really. The main argument is one argument. And here's how the argument goes. You have a farmer up in Wales, and that farmer, he knows that winter's going to be coming. So what he does is he gets the wooliest sheep to breed. Or he knows that his livelihood is based upon the amount of meat from slaughtering sheep, so he'll get the heaviest sheep to breed, or something else. What's happening is he is the designer. The farmer is the designer. The farmer is the intelligent agent. And the farmer selects one organism, another organism, to reach an intended outcome. Over several generations, you get a fatter sheep or a woollier sheep. Okay. Darwin said, let us suppose there is no farmer, but nature did this. So you have sheep, and some sheep, because of a random variation, some of the sheep, when they have children, say you have five sheep, one of them has more wool than the rest. That genetic element of having more wool passed on to one child. Winter comes, all of these sheep die because it's a bitter winter, much colder than the rest of the years. That sheep survives. And that sheep mates with another sheep from another flock or whatever that also has that genetic predisposition to having more wool. And then they have children. There's no farmer involved. And over generations, you get evolution. Okay. That's his breakthrough idea. Now, you may think to yourself, wait a minute. Is that it? His argument is, we used to believe that there is design. Now we know that it's the blind mechanistic force of nature. That's all it is. And you think, wait a minute. So Darwinism begins off with the first self-replicating organism. This is something very important, by the way. So Dawkins and all of these guys, they will admit Darwinism as a theory only begins when you already have the first form of life. It doesn't begin inorganically from non-life to life. It begins off with at least one reproductive organism, an organism that can reproduce. Okay? And that, when it replicates, when it divides, when it turns into, when it has, because obviously it's going to be asexual, right? It's just going to divide. There's going to be random variations, meaning one's going to be different to another. And then they're going to divide, and then you get one different to another. And then nature comes in, and some are selected over the others. And that over billions of years led bacteria, like organisms, single-celled organisms, basic organisms, to evolve through that simple process of random variation being passed on, the environment choosing the fitter organisms, and that led over billions of years from single-celled basic organisms down to Donald Trump. That's it. No, seriously, that is it. That is the grand idea of Darwin. And of course, on this, if you look at the root, which is the single-celled organism, right? If you look, the self-replicating molecule, that's a more precise term, that turned into a beautiful tree. You had bacteria, you had eukarya, you had archaea, and from the eukarya, you get the plants and the animals, and that's it. That is the idea. So a bumblebee, Donald Trump, an elephant, a trilobite, they all go back to one common, universal, common ancestor around 4 billion years ago. That's the idea. I know you're really underwhelmed by that.
Yeah, it's Now I was gonna ask, does Dawkins or anyone else ever explain how we move from asexual to sexual reproduction?
Oh, bro.
Because I feel like there's a huge part missing in that.
Yes. This is brilliant. The first thing you have to know is they believe it happened. We just have to find the evidence that it happened. They believe it happened. Why? Because of naturalism. However, the problem is, what's better at reproducing, bacteria or us?
Bacteria.
Okay. So if I want to get married, I have to go talk to the dad.
Please give me a sock, brother. Can take out bacteria.
Bacteria is asexual. They just divide. And now here's another conceptual problem. You have a half German background, so I'm going to give you this because you're all about efficiency, Germans, right? Think about this, brother, yeah? Under what conditions do bacteria survive and thrive?
Moist, warm, moldy, or whatever type of environments, yeah.
Okay, every environment.
Oh, okay, wow. Yeah.
Every environment.
So highly adapted.
Basically, they are adapted to live everywhere. Then they are everywhere. Okay. Why would there be a need to become into more complex multicellular organisms with sexual reproduction? You're constantly dividing. You are everywhere. So the question is, why? Now, here's another misconception. We've all seen the simple to complex. Yeah? That progression is not the way that Darwinism works. Darwinism is not, there's nothing inside which is pushing the organism to become more and more complex. They just think that's an accidental feature of life, that life became more complex. But if you think about it, how adapted bacteria are to the environment, we should not be becoming into these complicated creatures over time. Evolution is not progressive. This is very important. Evolution is not progressive. Bacteria, if it's adapted to its environment, why would it need to change into anything else?
They argue that it's just through like a random mutation. It doesn't necessarily have to be because there was a need. It was just like, the wool example that you were given.
Yes.
Could they make an argument that it was happenstance? It was rather than like need or what?
That is the argument they make. That is literally the argument they make. And the wall that they cannot go beyond is this. If you are to come up with a story of there was a random variation which took it off that tangent of being a single-celled organism to a multi-celled organism, you have to prove it was adaptively more beneficial to go down that route than remain a single-celled organism. And they don't have any evidence of that. But they believe it to be true. Why do they believe it to be true?
Could they still, like, with the whole point of like adaptability, could they say that, well, it doesn't have to be adaptably more efficient so long as there's some kind of a random mutation, and that random mutation doesn't really have a why per se. It doesn't really have a reason. It just happened to be like that. It could have been this way, that way, or the other way, but it just so happened that a single-celled organism divided and became a multi-celled organism as a random response rather than as a like adaptability kind of thing.
So that's a good point. They could argue, and they have argued, for neutral mutations. Mutations that are not adaptive and not deleterious. They're just neutral.
What's deleterious?
Just damaging. So remember something, yeah? Mutations, writ large, conceptually are harmful. They're not good for you. So you have, like any human being, you have copying errors that leads to problems, which is why this is a really good tangent we're going on. This is why they are married to gradualism. This is why it has to be ever so slow, because all of us, and nobody would deny this, any larger mutation is a deformity and the organism dies. Everyone knows that. So it has to be a small incremental thing. Now, they don't have any evidence for those environmental conditions to lead to what you said or what you said. They don't have any evidence of that, but they believe it to be true. And the reason why they believe it to be true, what we covered in the last session. Biological necessity, a Darwinian story has to be true. So they look at all of life and they're like, okay, it has to go back to be simpler, 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 simpler. This is the story we're going to come up with. And their argument is always going to be based upon the same analogy, which is, but we see this in nature. Do you guys remember in school they were banging on about Darwin's finches? You must have heard of Darwin's finches. Darwin in the Galapagos found these finches. Again, no different to the wool example. As Philip Johnson says, explain where the finches came from in the first place. Not some of them survived and had longer beaks over time than others. And like those small scale variations mean nothing. You need to explain the bigger picture. Where did the finches come in from the first place? Where did they get their features? Why are the organisms so complex? Where do you get the novel features coming in from? Why are these changes actually inbuilt? Because something else to keep in mind, this is what goes against Darwinism. The organism has the ability to change its genome or express it in a different way to suit the environment, as opposed to being taken out because of the environment. The exact opposite of what Darwinism says, which we're going to do in a later session. This session is more the broad picture. Okay. Now, another thing I mentioned is randomness. What do they mean by randomness? This is very important. What do they mean by randomness? We'll ask the philosopher here, anyone who does philosophy, what's the distinction between epistemic and ontological randomness? This is a very important distinction to make. Epistemic and ontological. Ontological is you believe in true randomness. Okay, the question is, from their worldview of naturalism, their starting point, do they really believe in true randomness?
They can't actually.
They can't. They can't. Maybe you need to give you the... They can't. Why can't they?
Randomness seems to be beyond the remit of empirical science.
Yes.
There's no way to substantiate such a thing.
So they believe in epistemic randomness. Epistemic randomness means we don't know the outcome before it unfolds. So for example, if I drop this coffee onto this table and it flows into a pattern, okay? That pattern we can say is an epistemically random pattern. We didn't know what it was going to be like. It's a we are ignorant about the outcome. However, if someone's sitting there who is a physicist who knows the air temperature, the angle, the velocity, the current, humidity, knows all of the factors, would they be able to predict where it's going to spill? So there's no ontological randomness. There is only epistemic randomness. Okay? The same analogy you can give in terms of snooker, you're hitting a ball, you think it's going to go all over the table randomly, but if anybody knows the friction, the surface tension, the velocity and all of that stuff, they would know. In the same way, when they say randomness, they are saying epistemic randomness. Meaning we don't know whether that random mutation, if it's going to be good, bad, or neutral. Okay? Now, another thing I want to cover is this. Whenever we are speaking about Darwinism, we're speaking about natural selection, right? Think of it as a table with 3 legs. Okay? A table with 3 legs. And you have to know this because if you understand this point properly, you'll be able to articulate what it is that we're arguing against. The first pillar is a pillar of variation or randomness. That's the first pillar. So you have a bunch of sheep. The sheep mate, and when they are reproducing, they are random copying errors in the DNA. And those copying errors, they are going to get passed on to the next generation. So the first thing is you have to have randomness. And in the later sessions, we're going to cover something which used to be unknown, and it seems really absurd, but nature is designed to fight off randomness. There's proofreading systems within the DNA, the exact opposite of what the Darwinists want. Anyway, first pillar is randomness. The second pillar is hereditary. You have to be able to inherit that randomness, that random change. So you have 2 sheep, Baba sheep, Mama sheep, they have child. That child, not only do you have to have the random copying errors, that child then has to have the ability to pass on those changes. So for example, one of them has more wool than the other, and that trait is dominating. They have a child, it's passed on to the child, and is able to be carried on to the next generation. So the first pillar is randomness. The second pillar is hereditary. You have to be able to inherit that random change. The third pillar is the struggle of life. There has to be some environmental pressure that will select that random change. And in this case, it's a bitter winter. By the way, when we say struggle, it could mean the environment or it could mean another organism. So all of us here, from a Darwinian perspective, we're not only fighting against the elements, we're fighting against each other. There's a, as David Stove says, it's you versus the postman. Yeah, so it's all against all. Okay, these 3 pillars together is how Darwinism works. Without it, it doesn't work. Okay, good. Now, Darwin gave the example of artificial selection, and he said, you can take this and you can apply it where? Where did he say you can take this example of, say, the sheep and the weather? Where can you apply it? Anyone have a guess where he thought you could apply this? Absolutely everywhere. He said, this thing has no limits. He says, that same thing with the sheep, that one thing can explain how we started off with simple life all the way to the tree of life. And that is basically Darwinism. That's Darwin's great idea. This is why I said to you guys, it's an underwhelming idea. It is really underwhelming. At rock bottom, that's what it's basically saying. Yeah? Now, I'm going to read out something funny, right? When I read this, it's just ridiculous. So if you can go to slide number 13 here. This is in The Origin of Species, the first edition. I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered by natural selection more and more aquatic in their habitats with larger and larger mouths till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale. Ahi, literally, he's saying That's all you need. You just need those micro evolutionary changes, those small incremental variations over a long period of time, and you can get from a bear to a whale. So if you want to summarize what Darwin's great idea was, it was the idea of natural selection plus random mutations plus imagination. That's it. That was his great contribution to humanity. Then he died. So the thing is, when you first understood this many years ago, when I was studying Darwinism, I was like, no, is that it? Is that the great idea? And this is why they get flustered. This is why they want to stick to the fallacy of equivocation. This is why when you watch a debate between Darwinists and intelligent design proponents, or Darwinists and others, you will find they do not want to justify this. Now, if Darwin was alive right now, how would you question him on this statement that he made? How would you question him? Yeah, take Mike.
Your theory depends on very small changes over a very long time.
Yeah.
Is the Earth even old enough to allow enough time for those changes to occur?
Okay. That's one way of arguing. But say there is enough time. Does that in any way prove his theory to be correct?
He probably doesn't have enough of generations to observe those changes himself, so he'll never be able to see it himself.
Sure. What would be his argument? And this thing, Darwin's logic is going to blow your minds.
Is it the fossils or something else?
Oh, no. In fact, one of the sessions we're going to do just on the fossil record. The fossil record in chapter 6, he highlighted to be a problem. So inshallah, what we're going to do is we're going to break it down into the genetics will be a separate component. The fossils will be a separate component. Today, we're doing the mechanism, yeah? What would Darwin's response be? If Darwin says, look, anything can turn into anything, yeah? Given enough time, variation plus selection, anything can turn into anything. You can have a bear turning into a whale. How would you challenge him? It's actually pretty obvious.
Is it the human example, or?
No, you'd simply ask him, what's your evidence?
Oh,
He's simply imagining things. He's saying that's it. Just like, and the example that was happening around the same time, not too far off, in America, they were doing this with slaves. They were getting a woman who's tall, a man who's tall and muscular, and getting... So Darwin's entire argument is an argument from design, from a farmer, from an artificial selector. Take that away, turn it into nature is the natural selector. Boom. The problem here is you're not explaining the origin of life, the origin of organs, the origin of body plans, the origin of novelty. You're not explaining. You're simply giving people an idea in their head, which is if you can get these small changes over time, you can do everything. Why they believe in this is because of naturalism. It's a naturalistic story. Other than that, there's nothing there. Now, what would Darwin's response be if we said to him, you don't have any evidence? He actually gave people a challenge. And this is the challenge that Dawkins, this is the challenge that all these guys basically till today, and don't let anyone tell you, we've moved on beyond Darwin. Okay, pick up any book today, 2025, or any paper, it's all about natural selection. So Darwin's brilliant idea of natural selection as an analogy for artificial selection is still the crux of Darwinism. So don't let people confuse you like that. What was Darwin's argument? If you said to him, but that doesn't make any sense. So you're telling me a simple organism can turn into Donald Trump or an elephant or a bee or a whale or a blade of grass? He's like, yeah, time, randomness, selection. Done. What was Darwin's response if you said you don't have any evidence? It's a brilliant response. Do you know what his response is? I'm going to read out the exact words, but I'm going to paraphrase what he's basically saying. What evidence you have? Like, he literally inverted the burden of proof. He basically said, if you want to prove me wrong, you have to show how an organism could not have developed gradually. Meaning you have to come up with a thought experiment to challenge my imagination. And you think, oh my God, are you being serious? He wrote this in The Origin of Species, right? If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But I can find no such case. He literally shifted the burden of proof. He's the one making the claim all of life is natural selection, random mutations, and time, rather than giving evidence for that, because it's all in his head, it's all in imagination, and he said it's possible. He's saying, but to prove me wrong, you have to show me an organ which could not possibly, conceptually, come around gradually. He's basically saying, you need to show my ideas incoherent.
Let's assume that AI becomes very developed and that you have AI cars, for the sake of argument. And that these AI cars have the propensity or ability to actually reproduce. You can have two cars that come together and they create another car by themselves. And they can survive alone. So maybe that would fulfill somewhat of the definition of what it is to be a living creature, yeah? And then these cars are the same kind of cars that we're seeing here, like the BMW, the Mercedes, the 4x4s, the small ones, the big ones, sedans, whatever. So does this mean that according to this theory, someone looking at all these cars would have to conclude that it came from one single cell and that it all came basically, all these cars that we're seeing, all these different variations, why do you have these BMW? Why do you have 4x4s? They all look like that because they come from one single common ancestor. Rather than there's a manufacturing plant, the BMW one, there's a manufacturing plant, the Mercedes one, there's a manufacturing plant. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Is that a good analogy?
Yeah,
or
this is actually why there almost certainly is a God by Keith Ward. He gives that exact analogy.
Really?
Yeah. The Oxford theologian.
Right. Of course.
He basically, so the answer that we can give him is you're shifting the burden of proof for us to basically give an example why your imagination is wrong. For something to be logically consistent proves it's logically consistent, nothing else. It doesn't prove it actually happened. He thinks if he has a logically consistent story, that is evidence. Evidence is not a logically consistent story. Evidence is evidence. Show us the fossils. Show us in the lab bacteria having small micro mutations which can build a new organ, which can build a new body plan. Because bacteria, you can have lots and lots of generations in a very short period of time. He doesn't do any of that.
And another thing you could ask is it necessary? So for example, we're not, apart from the randomness thing, because we could actually say that's actually impossible or something which is not, we don't accept the idea of ontological randomness, as you mentioned, yeah? But for the sake of argument, if we just say that, natural selection or whatever, is this chain of events that happen, is it a necessary, does it have to happen like that? It's very difficult for him or anybody else to have responded in the affirmative.
Unless you presuppose some form of naturalism.
Yeah.
Because then, if naturalism's true, then something like a Darwinian story has to be true, which is why, like I mentioned before, Richard Dawkins says if there's any form of life anywhere else in the universe, it has to be Darwinian. Because if naturalism is true, then by necessity, something like Darwinism has to be true. Okay? One more thing, just to make sure everybody understood. Why can't we have big changes, macro mutations? What's wrong with that?
It's when if there's
In
like
his imagination, by the way. Oh, in his imagination. Why is Darwin fixated on this idea? My theory will break down and I will be absolutely wrong if one case of gradualism, if something hasn't evolved gradually. Why did he say that?
because it's harder to believe and to like analogize to everything else, I guess. That's
Yes,
the reason.
but why? Good. Think back to the sheep. Yeah, why? If the sheep has a macro mutation, what happens? If it's not a minor one, if it's the bigger one, what happens?
Deformity.
It just dies. That's why Darwin wants to die on that hill.
What about like punctuated equilibrium?
So we're going to do that when we do the fossil one. Because
Isn't that what that is? Isn't it like a
so
exponential change?
since you mentioned it, and inshallah we're going to do the fossil separately. Paleontology is its own area, its own session, inshallah. The fossil record does not show gradualism. The fossil record shows stasis, rapid rupture, which they describe as punctuated equilibrium, and this particular expansion of body forms and organs and animals and all these types of things, they can't find antecedents. They can't find ancestors. And it's happening on a timescale that does not fit gradualism, which is why the fossil evidence against Darwin is so strong that some people have specialized in it and that's all they focus on. They don't go, we're going to be covering genetics, population genetics, we're going to do biochemistry. Some people literally just use the fossil record to destroy Darwinism. Gunter Betchley, he recently passed away in a car accident, German paleontologist. Stephen Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt. Darwin's Doubt, the reason he called it Darwin's Doubt is because in chapter 6, he admits that actually the Cambrian is a big problem for me. The Cambrian period, Darwin. Since then, we've discovered 17 new versions of the Cambrian. 17. It's the exact opposite. And Darwin's explanation for that was the fossil record is imperfect. And we've discovered more and more and more that actually the fossil record, yes, is imperfect, but it still doesn't fit your story at all. It doesn't fit gradualism at all. Okay. Now, I do want to emphasize something which is very important. Do not let anybody tell you we've moved away from Darwin. They use this as a rhetorical device. Because get rid of the name Darwin. Go look at the literature. It'll talk about selection mutation. There you go. Selection random mutation. Richard Dawkins, writing just a few years ago, again, he showed his commitment to gradualism. Evolution not only is a gradual process as a matter of fact, it has to be gradual if it is to do any explanatory work. It is a necessary condition for Darwinism to be coherent, that it has to be gradual. Some people have tried to say, should we move away from gradualism? Should we do this? Should we do that? Even T.H. Huxley, Darwin's mate, he wanted Darwin not to accept this idea that if gradualism fails, my theory fails. And Darwin said, no, if gradualism fails, my theory fails. Okay. Now, here's what Darwin wrote, so we all conceptualize his idea of his argument from artificial selection, yeah? Slow though the process of selection may be, a feeble man can do so much by his powers of artificial selection. I can see no limit to the amount of change to the beauty and infinite complexity of the co-adaptations between all organic beings, one with another and with their physical conditions of life, which may be affected in the long course of time by nature's power of selection. Read The Origin. Darwin's entire argument is an argument from analogy. Now we're going to do a special session on the tree of life. Morphology, genetics, biochemistry, how things don't fit. However, the tree of life as a concept was known before Darwin. Darwin's mechanism of artificial selection is what gave life to that old idea. Because they need a mechanism for the tree. And I'm going to be repeating this throughout because sometimes it can be a bit hard to conceptualize. Okay, now if we go to slide... By the way, who asked about bacteria? Was it you who asked about bacteria? So if you go to slide number 14, that's where I actually had a slide just on this idea of progression and bacteria and why we don't need to do that. Okay, now can you guys go to slide 15? This is super important. Darwinism is not a theory of similarity but transformation. What does that mean? This is very important. Darwinism is a theory of similarity, not a theory of similarity, but of transformation. This is one of the most important points I'm going to make today. Often we are told this gene is similar to that gene. This chemical pathway is identical to this. This morphology is identical, is homologous to this. This bone structure, this ear structure is similar to this. And that's supposed to be an argument for Darwin. Similarities were known, documented, written about, theorized about before Darwin. All of the biologists today are using the Linnaean system from Carl Linnaeus, who was pre-Darwin. The tree of life goes back before Darwin. John Baptiste Lamarck, before Darwin, is speaking about similarities. You have the Greeks talking about similarities. You have the Hindus talking about similarities. This is another fallacy of equivocation. Of course, Darwin's right, because look at a wolf and look at a dog. They're similar here. Again, that Darwin's argument is an argument from analogy. What they don't want to do, is they don't want to defend their central thesis, which is the blind watchmaker thesis. Which is interestingly, going back to the conversation between Hamza and Richard Dawkins, what you'll find is their level of certainty drops in the conversation. They'll begin off with outlandish things like evolution is like believing the planets go around the earth. Evolution is like gravity. And then they'll go into, well, it's like coming to a crime scene. Well, we can't see it. Well, we can't observe it. Now, in the second picture, you can actually see what Darwinism is. Darwinism is not the tree of life, which is the left picture. It's the right picture. You have an organism which has children. It has mutations, which allows it to be variant. And then the unfavorables are taken out and the favorables are reproducing. And then you get a change in gene frequency. And that micro change leads to monad to man, particle to people. Okay. Now, this is the most ridiculous thing, right, that I found. And sometimes when I'm reading this stuff, right, I just feel sad because I'm like, there's no one to talk to because this is so boring. But I want to share with someone. I found something just a few days ago. And I thought it was pretty exciting because of how ridiculous it was. Do you remember what I said that Darwin didn't actually provide any evidence for his book, for his claim? Everything was, why do you prove my imagination wrong? Yeah? Artificial selection can do this. Natural selection, random mutations, time. A bear can turn into a whale. A human can turn into, a particle can turn into people, right? 1959, 100 years after Darwin, there was a famous biologist by the name Catterwell. And he made a proclamation in a scientific journal. And he said, 100 years we are celebrating after the publication of The Origin of Species, and we now have evidence that Darwin did not have. We have Darwin's missing evidence. Because Darwin could not actually prove anything that he said. He could not prove the eye, the brain, an elbow, a trilobite limb. He couldn't show a single piece of evidence of natural selection creating anything.
Is this after Francis Crick and Sasser?
This is after Francis Crick. Yeah. Now check
And the same like
because remember Francis Crick, his contribution is to the origin of life.
Yeah.
His contribution is to uncovering the black box, seeing the double helix. Yeah. Darwin's evidence for natural selection. So Catterwell says we finally have the missing piece of evidence, and this is a scientific journal. If you go to page 16, yeah. So Catterwell writes, yet there were two fundamental gaps in his chain of evidence. First, Darwin had no knowledge of the mechanism of heredity. So he didn't know, Mendel's pea pots and how certain are dominant, recessive. But that can fit with intelligent design, that can fit with other theories, but that's not that important. Second, he had no visible example of evolution at work in nature. Remember, all of his evidence that they call evidence is his imagination. Time, natural selection, randomness. Okay. What was this piece of evidence in 1959? This groundbreaking piece of evidence. This was Catterwell, 100 years after Darwin, publishing about black and white moths that stay on trees. Okay? Industrial revolution led to the tree trunks becoming darkened. So the moths which were light, which were white, were being eaten by the birds because they could be seen. But the darker colored moths, now that the trees are darker, they're more likely to survive. So the color of the population changed from being less black to more black because of the pollution on trees. Okay. Can you be more underwhelming than that? This is not about origin of life. This is not about origin of body plans. This is not even about the origin of the wing. This isn't even about showing random changes in the DNA. This is simply, you had moths, which because of industrial revolution, the tree trunks became darker. So birds were pecking away and eating the white moths, and the black moths were surviving, having more children, and therefore they were spreading the population. And that is this magnificent, horse prize that they're putting forward to exonerate Darwin after 100 years. I know you're absolutely flabbergasted.
No. Are they saying that the black moths became evolved into white moths, or they're saying the other one just became extinct?
So there's a population of black and white moths.
Okay, got it, yeah.
Okay, and they're obviously going to interbreed. They're obviously going to do all of that, right? And because the white ones are being eaten, because they're being seen by the birds, the black ones are reproducing faster.
Okay, yeah.
Variation, hereditary, struggle of life. Okay. Like, this is what I'm telling you guys, that when you look into Darwinism, it is literally, why don't you provide evidence that our imagination is wrong? That is the crux of the argument. The crux of the argument is this, yeah? A bear can turn into a whale because, according to Darwin, look at his words. This isn't me putting words in his mouth, yeah? Look at his actual words. I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered by natural selection more and more aquatic in their habitats with larger and larger mouths till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale. I can see no difficulty. It's just an imagination.
They do believe that the whale started off on the land, isn't it? And then it became amphibious and went into the sea. So it's not like, that is actually what they believe. Maybe not a bear. I think it's like hippopotamus or something. I don't know what it is.
But the conceptual point is anything. It could be anything. Yeah. So you can have, and I remember this was really
No, but do you know, this might be a silly question to ask, you know,
Is this
but,
because-
you know, a lung deals with, you know, oxygen, etc. And a gill deals with things. So he's probably thinking that because, you know, the whales have lungs, isn't it? They have got lungs.
So it's a mammal.
Yeah, it's a mammal, isn't it? So they're going in, they're becoming aquatic and amphibious and stuff like that. That's the trajectory there.
So, from their perspective, anything can turn into anything.
Mm.
I remember watching a debate in Speaker's Corner many years ago, and Mansoor was debating an atheist. Yeah, Mansoor, may Allah bless him, is very sharp. Yeah, he goes, "Couldn't a human being turn into a potato over millions of years?" And the thing is, again, using the power of imagination, you know, you just evolving in a particular way, and the environment is such that those creatures that become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until you become into a vegetable. Well, technically, why can't you do that? Like conceptually, if you can have your imagination, I can have my imagination. I can be a bigger crackhead than you, right?
One more question, sorry, before I give that. Do you know, you were saying that they said that, you know, this guy, I forget his name, the one who wrote this journal in 1959,
Kettlewell.
and he was talking about the moths and stuff. You know, in the beginning of the session, when you were mentioning, for example, the penicillin, and you're mentioning antibiotics, and you mentioned these modern day examples, couldn't that now be cited instead of, for example, the moth example? So if someone says, okay,
But they're both equal, though.
yeah, no, but how would you respond to them saying, well, this is an example of evolution happening? And,
Okay, so
Yeah.
you know what's really funny?
Yeah.
Two things. If I observe bacteria and antibiotics being applied to them and them develop, I can't, from my visible eye, I can't see the inner processes. I can only see certain bacteria are surviving despite the antibiotics.
Mhm.
Both of those examples are equivalent. Okay? Both of those examples are simply examples of microevolutionary changes.
Yeah.
We knew this before. It's the same as the sheep.
Yeah.
It's nothing new.
Mm-hmm.
However, you know what's really interesting about the bacteria, and I'm glad you mentioned it.
Mm.
We've gone in now, and we can go in all the way deeper using technology and looking at what is happening inside the bacteria. And what we discovered is it's a non-Darwinian process. It's not even Darwinian.
What's going on there?
What we've basically discovered is bacteria, rather than getting attacked by antibiotics and then they're reproducing, and one of them accidentally has a variation in their DNA, which gives them a competitive advantage to survive against the antibiotics, which is their theory. We've discovered the opposite is true. We've discovered bacteria, because of their environment, they go in and express their DNA in a different way. They can actually change their DNA and they can fight off the antibiotics. So it's not the environment dictating to them, it's them adapting to the environment. And then through a process known as horizontal gene transfer, they transfer this technology to each other. It's the exact opposite of Darwinism. And this is known as natural genetic engineering. And you know what's so crazy about this? The first scientist who discovered a process similar to this in the 1930s, 40s, her name was Barbara McClintock. She discovered that when you apply stress to corn, rather than corn having random mutations and then adapting, corn goes in and reorganizes its genome to survive against the environment, which is the opposite of Darwinism. Her study was rejected for decades because it was non-Darwinian, it is the opposite of Darwinism. And 1983, she won the Nobel Prize. And after she won the Nobel Prize, she was still ignored. And her student is James Shapiro. Yeah? So one more point about this. This is why Perry Marshall, right? And Perry Marshall's a maverick in the field. He said, Barbara McClintock is more important than even Charles Darwin in terms of what she discovered. But what she's discovered is an intelligently driven process, not a reductive random process.
So, you know, in the beginning, you were delineating some of the differences between different types of evolution. You were saying that definition of Darwinism is different to, for example, like neogenetic engineering or whatever it may be, other the third way. Is it possible that you could just tell us some of the main differences, in a nutshell? Like, what is it? Because this seems to be a sticking point. When you had that debate with that guy, he was just talking about, he was trying to equivocate between Darwinism and evolution.
Yes.
And it seems like that is a sticking point for a lot of these atheists or naturalists or whatever it is. So how would you quickly delineate those?
So let me summarize what the conversation was.
Yeah.
I was arguing the blind watchmaker thesis is not a fact. Does everyone understand what the blind watchmaker thesis is? It's that natural selection plus random mutation plus time can create something. Okay? All Darwinists, that individual and other individuals, they know this is an indefensible thesis because they don't have evidence for this. So what they'll say instead is, but do you accept the idea that basically if sheep are in an environment and one of them has a random mutation which gives it a woollier fur, they're more likely to survive than others? Do you admit that certain bacteria, when you apply antibiotics to them, they actually develop resistance and they survive? Do you accept that evolution? Yeah, I do. Oh, I won the debate. And that is their basic point. This is why you have to define. And this is why also, look, it's a very simple point. We're the creationists. We are the villains in your story, right? No problem. If I was in their position, I would say, no problem. Let's talk about the blind watchmaker. Let's talk about Darwinism. Why is it, even in my debate with Aaron Ra, he's trying every maneuver to try and deny the term Darwinism as an academic term. And then his worst defense was, they only use that in Britain. They don't use that in America. And it's like, are you on crack? Like a journal like Nature, a journal like Science, they don't start changing papers as they're going across the pond. We know what's going on here. Why is it people like Richard Dawkins, when they're writing and they're publicizing, they explicitly say Darwinism. They explicitly say a Darwinian view of life. They explicitly say neo-Darwinism. They explicitly say we are talking about this. Why are they saying that? Because they know what these terms are. So unless you define these terms and you say to them, look, I have no problem with basic evolution, you will never be able to get them to see, well, actually, they already know what their position is. You'll never get their audience to see that they don't actually have a defensive position. Because what they want to do is, going back to slide 8, I know evolution is true, particles to people, because evolution can be seen, referring to bacteria. The fallacy of equivocation. Does that make sense?
Yep. So how would, just to put,
Use the mic, please.
Yeah. How would you differentiate evolution as a broad term from Darwinian evolution? And how would you differentiate Darwinian evolution from all these other types of evolution that you mentioned in the shortest time possible?
So I would say evolution is the observable fact no one disagrees about, which is microevolution. The blind watchmaker thesis, randomness, natural selection, creating body plans, creating organs, creating cells, creating asexual to sexual mechanisms. That is what we're talking about. Now, non-Darwinian evolution is a tiny fraction of academia. According to Dennis Noble, he thinks around 90-something%, 95% are Darwinists. And he believes his view is held by maybe 5%. So you can say, look, that's a non-Darwinian. And that's why in my debates, I don't debate, is third way evolution true?
Also, what are the main areas what does he believe?
So it's him, Shapiro, Scott Turner, and a whole group of people who are all saying this. Creationism, intelligent design, we reject. Neo-Darwinism, we reject. We want a third way. And within this third way, not all of them agree, but what they basically say is there's lots of processes which are non-Darwinian. For example, natural genetic engineering, which I described. The bacteria go in and splice their DNA, they make changes, adapt to the environment. Symbiogenesis, right, where organisms come together. Lynn Margulis, again, we're going to go over something she says later. She's somebody who believed that rather than competition, organisms can come together and they can actually become bigger organisms, and it's not competition, it's actually life working together in a symbiotic way. Then you have mutation-driven evolution. This is Masatoshi Nai, right? You have...
What's that one?
So he basically rejects natural selection being the driving force of life, or working on micro-mutations. He believes that you can have larger mutations. Now, some of their ideas are actually incoherent. I don't believe he's right. Why I highlight him is to show he's saying Darwinism's wrong, we need something else. Apart from that, you get genetic assimilation driven by epigenetics. So this is where fruit flies. Sometimes these concepts are a bit hard to explain, so it's better to give examples. You can have a bunch of fruit flies, and you can apply heat to them, you can apply shock to them, you can starve them as an evil. I'm not saying you should do that, that's what scientists have done. But so Conrad Waddington in the 1950s, he basically did this to a bunch of fruit flies. Classical Darwinism would say they'll die out. Some of them will have children which will develop a mutation, and that mutation will help those children to survive. That's Darwinism. He discovered an intelligently driven process. When you apply pressure, selective pressure, heat, death, starvation to fruit flies, rather than going through the Darwinian route of random mutations and surviving, they can actually have their genomes re-expressed in different ways to adapt to the environment. And within 14 generations, those changes, those epigenetic changes, can go into the genome. Totally opposite what Darwin predicted. Which is why Conrad Waddington, Barbara McClintock, James Shapiro, Dennis Noble, Scott Turner, all these people who've discovered non-Darwinian modes of evolution. This is the funny thing. They call us creationists. Do you know what they call them? They call them people who are dog whistling to us. Because they know, the third way evolutionists know, and we know, intelligent design proponents know, their view has clear theistic implications. The Darwinian view is supposed to take out theistic implications. This is why they see them as Judas goats. They see these people as traitors, and they attack them. The debate, the famous debate between Richard Dawkins and Dennis Noble, on which we have the Sapience publication, right? The death of neo-Darwinism. What the hell was the point of that debate? The whole debate was reductive material naturalism of Dawkins, which supports atheism, and Dennis Noble's view, which is holism, which can support theism. Well, obviously, Dennis Noble doesn't believe in God in that way. From what I've seen, he seems agnostic or atheistic, right? It's about the implications of the theories. This is why these are...
Dennis Noble holism thing, can you explain that a little bit more?
Okay. Dennis Noble's view can be broken down in this way. Think of Lego blocks. Mm-hmm. Okay? So, change from the Darwinian perspective is randomness, nothing else. So what goes on is you have DNA. Think of DNA as a block of Lego, right? Two organisms have an offspring. They have a brick that's gone wrong. It's a point mutation, it's an inversion, it's a duplicate, it's a random mistake. That gives that particular organism, that Lego DNA, an advantage, and that organism develops a new trait, and this happens over millions and millions and billions of years, and you get from simple organisms, self-replicating molecules, to man. Dennis Noble's view is incomplete. However, it's basically saying it's not a random process. It is an intelligent process. Where the intelligence came from, where the purpose comes from, he leaves it. Darwinism gets rid of the purpose.
How is it intelligent?
So the process is this. Rather than point mutations, random mutations, the environment, the heat, the shock, the postman, whatever it is, it causes the cells to communicate with each other, and they go inside their DNA, and rather than bricks, they have arches, they have beams, they have foundations, they rearrange the DNA. This is the problem.
This is what rearranges.
The cell. Cells. Okay, let me tell you something crazy. Yeah.
Okay, just to go back on this.
Yeah. All cells,
Yeah.
according to the third way evolutionists like James Shapiro, and he's published a paper on this, all cells are cognitive. The organism communicates with organs, the organs communicate with tissues, the tissues communicate with cells, and the cells can change their genome. And this is why it has clear theistic implications.
Do you know, like, sometimes...
You understand?
I understand what you're saying. Sometimes I look at the ants or bees or something like that, yeah, on these shows, David Attenborough, and they are communicating with each other in a very sophisticated way, probably better than the way we communicate with each other, right?
They don't.
Yeah, all kinds of stuff. Like, obviously this is like one ant to another. It's not the same as one cell to another. But is this the same kind of idea, but on a cellular level?
Yeah, the idea is the same. And the way it works is this. You see, bacteria, which was supposed to be the new prize horse for Darwinists, what they've discovered is that when bacteria is getting attacked, rather than simply the ones which are fit surviving and the ones which are unfit dying, they get attacked. They look at what's happening to them. They go inside their genome and they find a solution. And I'll give you a better example. COVID. It's actually even better than the bacteria example. In COVID, all of us here, to some extent, we had COVID, right? Did we all die out and only the ones with the random mutations that has the ability to survive COVID survived? So Dennis Noble uses the example of COVID. What happened is something known as somatic hypermutation, which is a crazy process. The organs communicated with the tissues, communicated with the cells. The cells went inside their genome, and the part of, because you know it's a long thread of 6 billion letters, our DNA, every single cell. They went to the part of the DNA which comes up with solutions for viruses, right? The antibodies. And what it does is it tells that part to hypermutate, and then it finds a solution like a slot machine. You know, like cherry, 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 lemon, 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 ching. You find it, then the cells tell each other and they fight off the virus. This is known as somatic hypermutation. And this is a process which Richard Dawkins could not explain because it's non-Darwinian when Dennis Noble put it to him.
How did you respond to it?
If you watch it, and I based my book on it, he had the standard Zionist narrative of we're fighting Hamas. We're doing, like, everything was, yes, but yes, that process exists. Yes, proofreading exists. Yes, epigenetics exists. Yes, genetic assimilation exists. But what matters is genes in a gene pool. And if you watch that debate, the debate is literally the Undertaker versus your local drunk guy in the park. Like, there's no match. Like, choke slam through the table, flying elbow, everything's there. And what you actually found is 2 years. 2 years after the debate, he still didn't open his mouth when Dennis Noble went everywhere talking about how he basically beat him in the debate. 2 years later, he writes a small email to a Forbes reporter who's investigating this. He says, I will respond to Dennis Noble with a whole chapter in my book. and I got the book as soon as it came out. I pre-ordered it before it came out.
What is that?
The book, it's called The Genetic Book of the Dead.
Or is it a recent one?
It just came out, yeah.
Oh.
I got the book and I went through it and he doesn't answer him. He still repeats the same narrative, and it's so sad because
But what exactly does he need to answer? What exactly?
okay, I'll give you a concrete example.
Yeah.
Somatic hypermutation, you understand.
Yeah.
Like, he couldn't answer that.
Mhm.
Another thing he couldn't answer is this. His book, The Selfish Gene, makes a distinction. The replicator, which are genes, and the vehicles, which is us. The replicator vehicle. According to the selfish gene perspective, you could take your DNA, put it A, T, C, and G, 6 billion letters, write it out in granite, 10,000 years later, replicate you. And he makes that argument in the debate. And Dennis Noble goes, no, that can't work. And he's like, why not? He's like, you need the mother's egg cell. Because the mother's egg cell, her life experiences, if she went through starvation, if she went through stress, those markings get imprinted upon the genome. And the actual machinery to read the DNA, to switch on parts of the DNA, the coding of what they say, and or if this, then that, the conditional logic of life, all of that is not in the is not in the genes, it's actually in the membrane of the cells. So what Dennis Noble's basically saying to him, it's a complete package, you can't break it down. So on many points like this, somatic hypermutation, genetic assimilation, symbiogenesis, all of these points, the Darwinists don't have an answer. So for 2 years, he kept his mouth shut. And then he wrote the book and he basically didn't address the point. And inshallah, in this coming Tuesday, I'm actually interviewing Scott Turner, and Scott Turner alongside Dennis Noble is the Third Way of Evolution. And he's actually written a formal review of the Genetic Book of the Dead, where he's tackling Dennis Noble. And he's in the live stream, you're going to see, I've gone through it. Scott Turner is going to do it in a much more academic way than I can. He's just going to show that, look, he still didn't answer the question. Yeah. So the Third Way evolutionists, they don't believe in God. They don't believe in God. But their theories have clear design implications. And they're so annoyed at this. Sometimes when I discuss it with them, these guys, I get accused of, you're misquoting the Third Way. So I've even got them to refute me on the live stream. I've even got them to say, by the way, you don't believe in intelligent design, do you? We don't believe in intelligent design, we reject it. Then I discuss it with them. But one thing that Dennis Noble also agrees, and others also agree, if you want to make a philosophical interpretation and you're a theist, there's nothing to stop you. And that's why Dawkins and collaborators like Jerry Coyne and others and PZ Myers, they don't want this to be taken to take off, because it has clear design implications. It has clear teleological implications, and that's what they don't want. Okay, how long do we have? Is it working? Everything's
Has everyone played Asra? Yes.
okay. What was the last slide I was talking about? The Darwin's missing evidence. Okay, now this is important. Everyone, please go to slide number 17. Okay. Now, imagination is evidence. Okay. Who is the most well-known Darwinist in the world today? Here's a clue. He tried to refute hijab a few days ago. Dawkins, right? Dawkins is the best proponent, the best one to articulate Darwinism. Okay. His book, which made him famous, was The Selfish Gene. And his next book, which facilitated his fame, was The Blind Watchmaker. And since then, he's also got a whole bunch of other books. So, Darwinian View of Life, River Out of Eden. However, there's a common thread in all those books, except for the God Delusion, because the God Delusion, he's going away from biology. All of those books, what evidence does he provide that's different to Darwin when it comes to the mechanism of evolution, when it comes to Darwinism? He provides imaginative stories in modern scientific terms. Darwin never used the term random mutations. He said random variations. He never used the term genes because he didn't know about genes. All Richard Dawkins has done, he's taken Origin of Species and he's taken biochemistry and genetics and all these things, and he's putting together stories using modern scientific technical jargon. There's a beautiful paper written by Philip Johnson. It's called The Storyteller and the Scientist. The Storyteller and the Scientist. So please go to page 17. Okay? Because of his philosophical starting point, science goes from simple to complex. Dawkins does not regard the existence of the staircase as something whose existence needs to be proven. What do we mean by staircase here? Anyone know? Gradualism. But rather as a logical necessity that only needs to be illustrated. Do you guys remember we spoke about logical necessity of Darwinism? The illustrations consistent primarily of imaginative stories and computer stimulations. Here, for example, is a synopsis of the Dawkins theory on the evolution of flight. Now look at this, right? What was Darwin saying about the bear and the whale? He's giving you a story. Here, Dawkins is just going to give you another story. How did you get the evolution of flight? So now Philip Johnson is quoting him in The Blind Watchmaker. To begin with, an ancestor like an ordinary squirrel living up trees without any special gliding membrane leaps across short gaps. It could leap further if it had something to slow a fall. So natural selection favors individuals with slightly pouchy skin around the arm or leg joints, and this becomes the norm. Now, any individuals with an even larger skin web can leap a few inches further. So in later generations, this extension of skin becomes the norm and so on. It is easy to imagine true flapping flight evolving from repetition of the muscular movements used to control glide direction. So average time to landing is gradually postponed over evolutionary time. Did Dawkins observe anything here? This is all his imagination in his own words. He is literally saying, imagine this, imagine this, imagine this, imagine this, imagine this, imagine this. When it comes to color preference, when it comes to trilobites, when it comes to humans, when it comes to flights, when it comes to asexual reproduction, when it comes to the different parts of the brain, every single thing, Dawkins and collaborators, what will they do? Here is a story. Here is a story. Here's an imagination. Imagine this. Imagine that. Imagine a land. But these are stories. And then when you challenge them, what do you have? You show me how my story is incoherent. You show me how my story is not gradualistic. But the thing is, if you come up with a story, it doesn't mean it's evidence. It's just a consistent story. They think a logically consistent story means it's actually true. Now, if you go to slide 18, Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould, both of these are evolutionary biologists. They actually openly called out Dawkins for his just so stories. Now, these are people who believe in human chimp ancestry. They believe in Darwinism, but they, as atheist academics, secular academics, they saw that these stories people are starting to believe as if they're real, but these are stories. So what they did is they popularized the term just so stories. Does anyone know where that's from? Rudyard Kipling's book, Just So Stories. So Just So Stories are children's stories. How did the elephant get its long trunk? Well, an alligator grabbed it and was dragging it in the water and it stretched, and an Ethiopian drew the spots on the leopard. These are Just So Stories. So that narrative that you saw in the previous slide, according to these guys, are just those stories. However, to the public, this is scientific data. To the Darwinists, this is data, this is evidence. And we would contend imagination is not evidence. Okay, slide 19. Something extraordinary happened in 2016. Something extraordinary happened. The Royal Society came together and they had a discussion. And the discussion at this society is a momentous occasion for a few reasons. Number one, the Royal Society is the most prestigious scientific society in the world. It goes back to the 1700s. It was headed by Isaac Newton. It was founded, one of the founders was Boyle, Robert Boyle. This is the oldest and the most prestigious scientific society in the world. In 1859, Charles Darwin came and he gave his theory, his origin of species at the same society. So this is the society where the origin of species was presented to the scientists. It's the most oldest and prestigious science society in the world. In 2016, two group of evolutionists turned up to have a debate. And the debate was between the third way evolutionists and the standard Darwinists. And the debate was basically, was Darwin right in his mechanism? Imagine that. Imagine over 150 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, we're told in schools, we're told in universities, we're told in social media and documentaries, even through politicians and even through, lobbying groups, it's true, you have to be an idiot to reject it. How can you reject it? It's so... And here you have the most prestigious society in 2016 discussing, does it even work? Now, obviously, the majority believe it does and a minority believe it doesn't. But the mere fact that they're having a discussion in 2016 is evidence that the public has been misled for decades. For decades, we're told, yep, natural selection, random mutations. 2016, they come together and they're like, does it even work? Does it even work? Isn't that shocking? Isn't that unbelievable that in 2016 they're having this debate? And this is why this debate was actually picked up by the intelligent design community. They actually attended. So you had Stephen Meyer, Gunter Beckley, and I believe Paul Nelson and Douglas. Quite a few of these guys turned up. Obviously, they're not going to give them any platform because this is only for the Darwinists and the third way evolutionists to battle it out themselves. However, they wrote a lot about this, but the mainstream media did not pick up on this. The documentaries don't pick up on this. Today, I dare you, go and watch a documentary about the origin of life and about evolution, even a BBC one. What are you going to see? Life came from non-life. Fact. That life evolved through natural selection. Fact. Both of these are false. Both of these are false. Yet, that patent misrepresentation, that patent falsehood, that patent lie is all across the world, multiple languages, in multiple settings, from the university textbooks all the way to documentaries. And that should be absolutely shocking to audience. Now, the opening speech was done by an evolutionary biologist by the name Gert Müller. Now, it's absolutely astonishing that Müller is opening his speech of this 3-day conference with this problem. There are three distinct problems, according to him, that have not been resolved: complexity, novelty, non-gradualism. Okay, before we break it down any further, complexity, novelty, new features, body plans and stuff like that, non-gradualism. What was Darwin's main idea? All of this. This is why Stephen Meyer, and this is the next slide, he writes about this, right? He goes, it does a really good job of preserving advantageous tongue twister there, changes, right? Talking about Darwinism, but it doesn't do a good job of innovation. And Muller and Newman, these are people who gave speeches there. Actually, they wrote a book on this, not the speech, had a list of unsolved problems of neo-Darwinism, and one of them was the origin of organismal form. And I thought, my goodness, isn't that the problem that Darwin was supposed to have explained back in 1859? Think about that. 2016, they're basically asking the question, was Darwin right in what he proposed to us in 1859? And 150 plus years, we've taught this to the public. It's absolutely unbelievable, right? So, phenotypic complexity. So phenotypic, what does phenotypic mean? Your phenotype meaning your characteristics, right? So we're not talking about genetics here, but you can apply to that as well. Phenotypic complexity. We have eyes, we have brains, we have hearts, we have lungs. We have this sophisticated architecture. Darwinian evolution, natural selection, random mutations, gradually, over time, bit by bit, explaining how the brain came about. Cannot do it. Cannot do it. Phenotypic novelty. We have new features in the fossil record. Where did they come from? What is the naturalistic Darwinian story for this? There's no evidence. Darwinism is insufficient. Third, non-gradual forms of transition. The fossil record, it shows the Cambrian explosion. It shows rapid expansion. It shows stasis, things remaining the same for a long time. None of this fits Neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism, rather, cannot explain any of this. Now, obviously, the third way evolutionists, they laid into the Darwinists, and the Darwinists laid into them, and they went back and forth. 3 days later, nothing. No conclusion. Why are they telling the public they have this worked out? Now, we can get into all these terms and what they mean later on. They have many different ways of trying to explain this. So you have the people saying, yeah, but we have phenotypic plasticity, we have niche construction, we have natural genetic engineering, we have symbiogenesis, we have somatic hypermutation, we have epigenetics, we have genetic assimilation, we have bioinformatics, which is informing us of this. You can do all of this jargon, you can try and move things around. This fits here. Ultimately, one thing is for sure, if you're having this bloody meeting in 2016, it means you should have had it in 1860 rather than 1859. You should have had it in 1870. You should have had it in 1900. The public should not have been told for decades. We know the origin of life. We know the origin of species. We know how everything worked out. When you, in your scientific literature and at the highest levels of your scientific academies, you are disagreeing on the core fundamentals. And the mere fact of this public deception, the mere fact of this public disinformation, propaganda, is enough of a reason not to trust these Darwinists. Last time I went over Darwinism and the millions of people that have been affected by it, right? The evils of social Darwinism and what it led to. That is a non-epistemic reason to hate this theory. This is an epistemic reason to hate this theory. What the hell is going on? Why couldn't you just tell the people there were problems with this theory? Because this theory, as Richard Dawkins says, it allowed us to be intellectually fulfilled atheists. It allowed us to believe design is an illusion. It allowed us to hold on to our naturalistic Genesis story. That's why they cannot show the king has no clothes. The late Lynn Margulis, she's somebody who, as I described, I think in my last session, she said in the future, they're going to discover, or they're going to rather describe Neo-Darwinism as an Anglo-Saxon religion. You know, she says this very interesting statement. This is the issue I have with Neo-Darwinists. They teach that what is generating novelty is the accumulation of random mutations in DNA in a direction set by natural selection. So that's the standard stuff that we've been covering today. If you want bigger eggs, you keep selecting the hens that are laying the biggest eggs, and you get bigger and bigger eggs. But you also get hens with defective feathers and wobbly legs. Natural selection eliminates and maybe maintains, but it doesn't create. This is the problem. When you say to them, natural selection doesn't do this, but natural selection maintains, but natural selection exists, nobody's denying that. And they define that as Darwinian selection. Can you not see Darwinian selection is there because woolier sheep are likely to survive? Who cares? Can Darwinian selection create? Blind watchmaker. No, it cannot. She goes on to say, Neo-Darwinists say that new species emerge when mutations occur and modify an organism. I was taught over and over again that the accumulation of random mutations led to evolutionary change, led to new species. I believed it until I looked for the evidence. She is one candid Judas goat, right? She's openly saying, yep, the king has no clothes. Majority will not say that. Majority will not say these things. Minority say these things. However, we have the right to ask the question. We have the right to question. We have the right to say, why were you telling us this is true for decades? Why were you using your imagination and pretending as if that's evidence? Why were you hiding disconfirming evidence? Like the fact that the fossil record is not gradualistic. Like the fact that we've discovered processes like niche construction and natural genetic engineering and symbiogenesis and somatic hypermutation and genetic assimilation. Why are you hiding this from the public? Why can't you accept that randomness is not a god? Natural selection is not a creator. Why are you forcing this down our kids' throats? And in our schools and in our libraries and in our documentaries, and anyone that challenges it, you are anti-scientific. You are being anti-intellectual. You are a creationist. And if you happen to be someone, if the critics happen to be atheists, you are a secular creationist. There is no theory in the history of humanity which has caused as much sociological damage as Darwinism. And there is no theory which is as protected from criticism as Darwinian evolution. And there's not a single theory which has led to the level of disinformation, propaganda, and patently absurd lies and just so stories as Darwinism. And this is why we have to challenge it. Now, my last slide. This is the book, The Death of Neo-Darwinism. This book was published by Sapience Institute. It's me and Salman, but from he's coming at it from a purely scientific perspective. I'm coming at it from a philosophical and scientific perspective. And what we do, we break down the debate between Dennis Noble and Richard Dawkins. And what we do is we show what is actually going on in simple terms, because a lot of people cannot understand the revolution that is actually taking place in biological sciences, and a revolution that might actually be quashed if it faces enough resistance, which it looks like it is at the moment. And the second book is Dawkins Deselected, The Extinction of New Atheism, again published by Sapience Institute. And in this, it's not just science, it's how Dawkins and his collaborators misused Darwinism to justify their neo-atheism, and you will understand in this book why they will defend Darwinism as a religion, and you'll also find evidence that Darwinism is a religion as it's been called out by secular atheist academics. And once you understand in that book, Dawkins Deselected, the mindset of the Darwinists, you will understand why the materialistic Genesis story has to be held together, why criticism has to be stifled, and why legitimate questioning has to be ridiculed, and everybody has to follow the Darwinian line, or else you're going to be labeled a creationist. And they're going to use that to propagate atheism and their worldview. So Jazakallah khair for listening. That is the end of the session. And we can do the next session, inshallah, same time next week, where we're going to delve into another aspect of Darwinism. Everything good I've said is from Allah. Every mistake is from myself. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.